defined and have sensible feelings. So there's the faculty of the imagination that's exercised both in art and in literature. And all I want to say about the literary representations is the depictions of the suffering of slaves is a story that you will also see the depiction of the suffering of workers in industrial novels, the sufferings of other people as reported by journalists, autobiographies. So there's both a fictional and a non-fictional journalistic growth of a literature that pushes us to imagine the suffering of people at a distance. So at the end of the course, we're going to be reading a novel, about a woman who was captured in the dirty war in Argentina and was tortured. And I gave you the novel rather than part of the judiciary report. She's going to come and talk to our class as well. I give you the novel because it gives you, it's supposedly quote accurate. I mean, it's not a fantastic novel, but it's a novel that you'll get into and you feel, what would it be like to be caught up in the middle of the night and go, this be done to you? Right? So that's the part of this growing literature of the form of the humanity, facts, and now somebody to connect these facts to us through the power of the imagination. And I just want to give you some sense of this. This is going to be relevant to our next lecture, the Turkish atrocities, as they're called in Bulgaria. So we British need to intervene in these kinds of cases. You'll see this when we talk about the Congo next week. The Heart of Darkness, the fictional version. We're going to be reading some non-fictional journalistic accounts. Pictures you'll see are of this genre. It's true in anti-war literature. This is from an important German anti-war pamphlet after the First World War, pacifist literature, which says, look, this is what war produces. Don't look at this at abstract numbers. Look at this individual bodies looking like this. Bodies in a grave. You'll see this both. We don't see it much in military context because it's forbidden by most countries. But this Holocaust picture, it could be a Rwanda genocide picture, right? I mean, it's a generic, horribly generic, but it's how we come to see these kinds of mass. Same thing is true of famine. Right? So what I'm suggesting to you is, beginning in the late 18th century, we have the creation of this imaginative apparatus visually and in novels and in non-fictional narratives, and eventually by the 20th century in film, as we'll see, which allows our imagination to connect these facts. And we still do this. So we at our museum now have pictures that from the great Latin American Colombian artist Botero. This is one of a massacre in Colombia. This is a big series of Abu Ghraib. And if you go to our art museum, some of these are up in our art museum right now. You can see them at the Berkeley Art Museum. So these are his reactions to trying to imagine what Abu Ghraib was like, and then conveying this to a public who sees the pictures. All right. So, and this finally, this is Turner's picture in 1840, harkening back to the Zong disaster, painted in order to encourage the anti-slave trading action of the British Navy. And you see here people being thrown over. You see a manacle, this sort of phantasmic picture, and you see a detail of it here. So this is very much then about the emotional horrors of this case, which is still alive in anti-slavery movements 60 years later. Okay, so we now have the notion of facts, and we have the notion of the imagination in place. There's two features of this. What's the third central version of this? Well, one of the third central notion of this is that you have to bridge the gap between what happens somewhere else and us. Okay, so horrible things happen. It's the Chinese Mandarin story, but we can't do anything about it. All right? I mean, what are we supposed to do about it? And if we can't do anything about it, we don't have to worry ourselves very much, right? Because you're under no moral obligation or any other sort of obligation to act if you're actually powerless. So, how do we explain deal with then this third feature, facts, imagination? The third one I would suggest is bridging the gap. And I want to suggest that bridging the gap is basically a history or story of understanding causality. First part of this is that suffering is not a fact of nature. It may be caused by nature. But increasingly in the 19th century and in the 20th century, things that seem to be caused by nature also come to be seen as at least nature does its work through the complicity of humans. So if any of you follow the literature on Katrina, of course there was a horrible hurricane in New Orleans. It didn't have to be that horrible. The problem with Katrina was, and we don't argue that this is particularly true, but the argument was made that, look, people didn't pay a lot of attention to these very poor people. People didn't make the kind of provisions that they would make in other places. People from better hospitals were transported, people from poor hospitals were not transported. And there's been a huge amount of work, if somebody do public health and sociology of medicine, you'll see this. For example, if you look at who dies in heat waves, people who die in heat waves tend to be people who live in first-floor apartments in poor areas, where they bar windows because they feel unsafe. Older people. So there's a very clear epidemiology of who dies in heat waves. And it's not surprisingly, you will think, related to class. The poorer you are, the more likely you to die in a natural disaster. So even natural disasters are not quite natural in the kind of suffering they cause. But even if they are natural, it doesn't mean that one can't do anything to ameliorate them. But an important point is that suffering is not a fact of nature. Comes to my second point that I already spoke to. Suffering is caused by human action or inaction. There's a cause and effect relation of what we do and what happens at a distance. In other words, we could campaign for legislation which would make some of these issues, facts of nature, less deadly. Less crowding on ships is a 19th century issue. Greater safety on railways. Better food distribution. I mean, all sorts of things that we do. So yes, there's a famine in India, but the famines aren't just caused by nature. They're caused by screwed up transportation. They're caused by greedy middlemen. There are all sorts of things that we can actually do something about. So I want to give you an example back to the slave trade, and this will bring me to the Nike story. We're talking now about bridging this gap. So how do we bridge this gap? Let me tell you how the poet, before I talk about the picture, how an anti-slavery poet, William Cooper, spoke about this in 1788 in the context of a bill before Parliament that we spoke about earlier, that was to limit the number of people on these slave ships to protect the lives and limbs of slaves from want and cruelty. So he writes, "The enormity cannot be palliated. We can no longer plead either that we're not aware of it or that our attention was otherwise engaged to make it excusable for ourselves if we leave these wrongs unredressed. We now have these sort of facts. And if we have these sorts of facts and we know we could do something about it, it's wrong not to do something about it." So what could we actually do about it? Well, one small thing, and actually fairly important thing, it was argued in the late 19th century, was to not buy the products of slavery. Now, we spoke earlier about the issue of communication and this broadening of the communicative network in which we're all embedded. The other broadening, of course, is the broadening of world commerce and of capitalism. Slavery is part of a world economic system in which goods flow from one place to the other. The possibility of action at a distance is also part of a world economic system. In other words, if you make a contract for something in Liverpool or in Bordeaux or in a northern Dutch city, you expect that contract to be met and honored in Rio, in Jamaica, or somewhere else. So there's economic action at a distance, and there's legal action at a distance, and the world starts to be connected in a way that it hadn't been connected as powerfully before. So sugar